API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code INTERSECTION10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. So over the last, year and a half or whatever we've done this thing, on numerous occasions, I've probably said, and in fact, I may have here, I'm not sure, even used the word vampires to describe usage-based billing. So I'm just going to say now, ahead of introducing our guest, that this is going to be a different look at when does that actually make sense. Which is to say that I do believe that usage-based billing is okay sometimes, but it'll be a fun discussion. So I want to introduce Behailu Tekletsadik, and yes, I practiced, and yes, I'm proud of. And did I say that right?
Yes, you did. Hi, everyone. Great to meet everyone.
So he's coming to us from Archetype.dev, new startup kind of spinning up, focused on usage-based billing and APIs. But you tell me more. Tell us a little bit about what y'all are doing.
Yeah, sure. So essentially what we're doing at Archetype is we're building a solution for API first companies to essentially enable them to monetize their APIs and essentially manage out a lot of this infrastructure that it requires, right? So when it comes to building flexible pricing models for each of their enterprise customers, to assigning permissions, roles, to managing their API keys, authentication, to rate limits for each of their endpoints. We totally, and in addition to basically managing the accounting and invoicing that comes with managing and tracking all the usage records. We sort of own all of that end to end. So companies can really focus on building their core product and their core value prop. We tend to find that a lot of companies are very distracted by building this. And when it comes to offering different custom plans, thinking about experimentation and actually trying to figure out what to charge their customers in the long run, it ends up being a huge nightmare for these companies. So we just sort of wanted to make that less of a pain point.
Which, by the way, I want to add, that's why I generally tell people this kind of advice of you probably don't want to do that because it's always freaking hard. So I am kind of jazzed at the value prop you guys have on trying to solve this. I think traditionally this has been a thing that the API gateway companies have kind of tapped into. So does that play a role in what you guys are doing?
So that's actually kind of interesting. So what we do is we actually interface directly with people's backend. So if you wanted to build an API gateway on top of what we've done, we sort of allow you to do that so you can build it at scale. We didn't want to tie people to different API gateway services. And I've talked to some people that worked at these API gateways. A lot of them tap into it, but they haven't really made it a core focus because I think it's such a different problem versus what they're doing with the gateways.
Yeah, I mean, you're taking on a lot of inherent complexity, latency, all those things with gateways, and I think increasingly with Kubernetes-based infrastructure and things like Envoy, right? A lot of the traditional gateways aren't really playing a role in some of the more modern infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I think that's smart. Another fun bit here in the show notes, I noticed you had worked before on or currently still theoretically working based on your LinkedIn profile on a product called Lantern, an iOS app. But I'd love to hear you share the story here on how did you go from Lantern to now working on API billing stuff?
Sure. So that's kind of an interesting story. So my co-founder and I, we started Lantern in 2020 because we basically saw an opportunity in the market around options trading. And we saw that, hey, a lot of retail investors out there didn't really get access to option market insight. Ourselves, we lost a ton of money, trading options. And we figured, this is a huge pain point. So we did that for about a year through an iOS app, providing insights, doing some really cool stuff, working with a lot of the, big exchanges and whatnot. But about a year in, we quickly realized there was a lot of value in the data that we were sourcing because we were getting a lot of the option market data in real time, pretty much every transaction. And people found that really, really valuable. So we tried to spin up an API and ended up taking us 2 months to sort of just take what we had like in our existing infrastructure and launch it like in a monetizable way. And a lot of that pain came from the fact that we had no idea how to like sort of like build this. Think about like, entitlements. Think about, how do we charge each of our enterprise customers like, a different plan, a different amount for each different plan? How do we think about like creating a self-serve model, managing people's API keys, letting people reset their API key? It was actually a very generalizable problem, and we had no idea how to. It took us a long time to sort of like build this up just from like a raw Stripe, and we quickly realized, there was a huge pain point, a huge opportunity here. When talked to like other fintech API, a lot of them ran through the same problem that we did. So in September, we sort of like started talking to a bunch of companies about like sort of like the pain points that we encountered. There was a lot of overlap. And then in December, we started working on it. We saw a lot of opportunity, got a lot of LOIs. Started working on it like more aggressively in February, closed around there. And then realized, Archetype is definitely the way to go. Like huge, much, much bigger opportunity here. And with regard to the Lantern, we were thinking about it getting it acquired as of September because people had been trying to acquire us for a very long time. So we figured like now was the right time. So, I mean, if you look at the markets right now, it's probably fortunate that we sort of like decided to take a stab at this earlier rather than later.
I love it, man. I love the roller coaster origin stories of bright ideas and startups. I think of like Kong starting as Mashape and then figuring out that, their whole open source API gateway thing was kind of the future and selling off the Mashape side of the business. Rebilly, originally focused on billing, ended up, focusing more on the developer portal and documentation aspect and launching Redocly. So it's funny how often in the kind of this API space, we're all trying to figure out how to make these problems more efficient in building some other product, and you end up building an API-centric thing. But I'll just say, I love those stories because they're solving selfish problems, which sounds bad, but like that's what drives people to actually get stuff that makes sense, right? Because you've actually felt the pain. So I love that.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's a lot of context lost when you build products or solutions for problems that other people have, right? For a problem that you have, you sort of like will understand intimately what your problem is. You just sort of have to contextualize it into what is a you problem and what is like a problem with like the existing market, right? If that makes sense.
So I guess back to our framed point of contention here in some ways, which is, so my perspective is always like, especially with a lot of SaaS-based products these days, it's like if you're charging on some value point and then you want to have the ability to integrate, it's like don't create a barrier to adopt the API by pricing it. That said, like there's a whole other category of things that are a little more commoditized in their nature that are innately priceable on usage. Like I'd love to hear your thoughts on, for listeners, kind of what's the right way to think about when this is an appropriate sort of pricing strategy for APIs.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I would say like there are two theaters of thought here, two schools of thought here. With subscription-based models, like essentially you have a flat rate pricing. So customers from one end who barely use your product are paying the same amount as customers who love your product and use it super regularly. And I think the idea behind usage-based pricing is the idea that you want to charge people for the value that they get from your product, and in as close to that as you can, right? And with that, like it's obviously going to be like very specific to the sort of products that you have, right? So let's say you have. I feel like a good example is, let's say, an NFT minting API, right? Let's say you could charge people a subscription for minting, let's say 100 NFTs. But what if you just wanted to charge people, let's say, $1 for every mint that you do? Like, let's say that's a lot more palatable, I think, to people, because how many NFTs are they going to mint like every month? And I think that's going to drive a lot more adoption. There's also some stuff too. Like I know there's a big industry, for KYC APIs, like, Checker, for example, where essentially they charge for usage on top of like, let's say, a base commitment.
And for listeners, KYC being know your customer, sort of like identity type stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Identity verification is very, very hard. There's a lot of companies like Identity Pass, which is a fellow Matt Porco, where they also charge for usage, right? Like it really depends, right? You're not going to charge for a usage amount for, like, let's say Netflix, right? I always use Netflix as a good example for, like, usage based, even though it's not like the most appropriate model, but hopefully that contextualizes it a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's like if you can clearly see that like value per call is
Mhm.
quantifiable and that there isn't some existing subscription model in place already, um, and then it makes sense. And I mean, to some extent, if you're going to launch a product that is only an API, well, yeah, you've got to have something. And I
Yeah.
guess that's my other curiosity here is like, and I know you're still very early in, and in some ways, by the time this airs, really kind of starting to open the doors a bit. But in terms of kind of early discussions and learning, how much do you think that like API only kind of products versus folks trying to be API first and adding an API into an existing product? Like, how do you see you guys fitting in between those worlds?
I think we can fit into both worlds fairly easily. API first companies, companies that are launching APIs are going to find this sort of like more easier to integrate, I think, because we can be with them from the very start. Companies that already have an existing infrastructure in place and they have a clear and present pain point, let's say with, like, doing their accounting or, like, tax reconciliation, like, manually, versus, like, doing something automatically through Archetype, or companies that sort of like want to build in, their own, like, permissioning system. Like, and they have something baked in already and they just want to switch over to something that's easier or, like, more performant. That'll be a little bit more difficult, but I think the pain point is so big there that they're much more willing to integrate a solution like Archetype. That's sort of how I see it. And there's definitely like a couple, like, buyer personas I think that we can, like, fit into fairly well across both groups.
Both of us coming from a software engineering background, although you've touched code a lot more recently than me, I'm sure. But putting my product hat on here, um, I'd love that you guys are talking about figuring out like willingness to pay kind of stuff, right? Like experimentation. Um, is that something that you're leveraging some other existing experimentation platform? Are you, like, I don't know, it's a weird one for me to think about with kind of API stuff. And is this just more about kind of, what you're showing on the pricing page and correlating it to API tokens, or how do you see that working?
So this one it's less of a platform tool that we can use and more of like a benefit of using Archetype. We're still fairly early on in sort of like that school of thought, but essentially the idea behind it is you can charge like let's say like have a general model, like let's say charge people $10 an API call for something and see the usage. Like how much revenue did you just generate in the last month? And then spin up a new pricing model like the next month and then just see how much people are willing to pay there, like, all else being equal. And then from there, you can do some comparison. And we sort of like allow users to have the flexibility to do that. I think obviously there's a lot that can be done, I think, to make this like more intelligent and build some like smarter insights around that. And that's sort of like what my co-founder is going to be doing because he has a data science background here.
So, I mean, as you look at what you guys have learned in researching this space, leading up to kind of launching, what do you kind of see as sort of, best practices around, API billing, obviously with usage based, but there's certainly other models out there.
Mhm.
And are there kind of existing models out there that folks could sort of look to emulate when they're thinking about their pricing and packaging strategy on APIs?
Yeah, there is some interesting stuff. I think like a lot of thing that we've seen is people want to offer volume based discounts if they're doing usage based pricing. And I think there's a lot of systems where they can't really do that right now, which thought was kind of interesting. I think if you are doing usage based pricing, definitely think about like whether doing volume based discounts makes sense to your customers. And then there's some other things around, can you can you charge a commitment, right? Like a minimum for their usage. And then, like, let's say your usage is free for the first 10,000 API calls. And then, 10 cents for the next, like, 100,000. And then, like, offer volume based discount from there. There's a lot of ways that you can sort of like think about pricing as well. And I would also, when you're thinking about it in the context of API, just take a look at like what are your users doing? Are there APIs that people are finding much more valuable, or endpoints that people are finding much more valuable, or certain sections of their data, like certain fields that they're searching for that tend to be more commonly searched, and think about like whether is that going to be taxing on you? Is that more valuable? Can you charge more for that? I think there's a lot of things that people can do to like optimize their revenue here. And then when it comes to subscription based, like obviously there's going to be like it's going to be I feel like a lot more straightforward as well. But like then it's just like really thinking about like how much can you charge and how much value are they going to get out of your product?
Yeah, I love that concept that you touched on, that it's like, how taxing is this going to be for you? I feel like it's,
Mhm.
for me, it's always an easy way to justify the value of something in API terms, is like, sure, we can provide this, but it's going to cost us a lot of system resources. It's going to be hard to scale, and thereby it's expensive. Versus something that's maybe a very solved problem, very optimized, should be relatively cheap, right? Or
Yeah.
something that's so commoditized. There's so many options out there. It's so competitive, and that you could probably find something open source and do it yourself. But I think sometimes that like complexity cost isn't always part of the equation in how folks think about pricing.
Yeah, yeah. No, it especially matters if you're thinking about something that's like regulatory, like let's say scanning people's IDs or their passports or something going back to the KYC example. Like that can be some fairly expensive computations. You probably have some sort of like uh, computer vision going on as well, or like you're probably using some sort of like resource off Google or something to do that. On top of that, like you have to like scan work with the government to do that. They probably charge you a lot. So there's a lot of stuff that goes with that, and that's how like you have to think about pricing as well.
I guess the other thing that comes to mind when I think about this subject is like, those of us who've been in APIs for a while all have had that client who accidentally pushed an infinite loop to production on a Friday night. It just goes banging away at the API, and you're digging around on LinkedIn trying to find them. And hey, what'd you do, man? Like, you're calling us a million times a minute. Which I would think from a billing and pricing standpoint, you'd want to like somehow alert somebody that this
Yeah.
is happening, right? So I'd imagine that sort of these anomaly detections would be important.
Yep, they are. There's something that people have given us some feedback about. Like, there's also the idea of using a soft cap and a hard cap. Like, let's say a soft cap, you give an alert to like a certain customer that they've reached, let's say 80 or 90% of their threshold. And then a hard cap, let's say if they've gone like let's say 110 or 120% of their usage, and just like cap it there. Just so they don't like blow their entire budget. And if it was like a mistake, you can go back and reconcile it. Be like, okay, like clearly you guys like did not intend to do this or something like that. There's also a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can do. You can tie it to webhooks. Just like have some Slack alerts as well. When as a vendor, just saying, hey, this one customer using this API like a million times when they're only like meant to use it like a thousand times, for example.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It'd be nice if everybody had some sort of performance baseline testing when changes get pushed. But if you've been around software engineering long enough, there's rarely time to build those things. So stuff happens. um, well, it's funny. We end up on the show here with a lot of folks that come from really well established programs that everybody knows about. But I've spent a good chunk of my career in startups, and always have a heart for folks that are trying to figure it out and come up. So now you guys are right on the cusp of kind of launching here in kind of prime time. So any sort of call outs to listeners here on kind of where all that's going here in the month of September 2022?
Yeah. I would say if you guys are interested in thinking about usage-based billing or flexible pricing models, and you're sort of like struggling with that, or like automatic tax reconciliation, or anything like that, feel free to give us a shout out. We're happy to give demos, give people walkthroughs, and get people on board using their product. Yeah.
Cool. Any other closing thoughts, words of wisdom on the subject here?
That's a good one. I would say one thing is obviously usage-based billing is not right for everyone. And you have to be very careful about like how you think about it. And you don't want to sort of like just jump into a new pricing model before before you're even ready or before you've done your research into whether it makes sense. And one of the big things that we're trying to do at Archetype is we give people the flexibility to do that. Um, Even if you just want to charge a subscription or just like a usage-based model, there's also like it's really just like a flexible pricing model that we can sort of like let customers use it for.
Yeah, it's cool. I think of it, and I don't know, I'm like actively thinking here while we're talking, but
Yeah,
it's like quite often the challenge is how do you get adoption
yeah,
on an API, and sometimes folks try to put monetization in front of that and don't balance those concerns. And it's like depending on what you're doing, making sure that even introducing usage-based pricing could be such a barrier to adoption that it's just not a good idea at all.
Mhm.
Um, but that if you don't have any other monetization lever for the functionality that you're providing, well, obviously. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an intriguing one, and certainly my call out to listeners here is like I'd love to hear more about your thoughts, or kind of is there good guidance out there on this stuff? I feel like it's a subject everyone grapples with, and there's nothing great to go like read up on, but maybe I just don't know where to look.
Yeah. I mean, we have a couple of blog posts on our site where we talk a little bit about this. I would say when it comes to getting adoption, I would say, regardless of whether it's subscription or usage based, you have like a couple avenues here, right? With a subscription, you can have like, let's say, a 7-day free trial or like 14-day free trial. And with usage, you could also go the freemium route where like you have, let's say, the first 1,000 API calls are free. To go beyond that, you sort of like just have to enter your credit card and then just like add more details, right? There's a lot of flexibility here. And I've seen some companies that don't even think about monetization. They're just like, we're in public beta, we're capping everyone at like 1,000 API calls or something a month. We just want to get adoption, see whether people even like the product before we introduce monetization, right? Because they want to make sure that people actually like the product before they even think about building the billing infrastructure. And I think with a solution similar to like Archetype or whoever else you go with, if you introduce that early, you can just like pull that monetization lever like immediately and introduce freemium and just like if people are driving value from your product, they'll be much more willing to pay in the and much faster.
Yeah, awesome points, man. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. And I just want to say, like, I'd love to hear back from you in a year or so and see how all this how all this plays out.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time here, Jason.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.